So thank you so much for joining us today. So on behalf of the Science of Teaching seminar series and with support from the Biological Sciences Diversity Committee, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Jessi Smith, who's joining us today. And so she's coming to us from Montana State University, where she's a professor in the psychology department. And she got her Ph.D. in social psychology at the University of Utah and began her professor career at the Ohio State University and then joined MSU in 2006. And Jessi is an incredibly successful researcher. She has over 50 peer-reviewed publications, including those in PNAS and Science, and her work has also been featured on lots of popular media outlets, Inside Higher Ed, Amy Poehler's blog, Smart Girls. So her work is extremely important and relevant, and the publications and media outlet reviews help show that. So she specializes in social psychological aspects of gender, race, sexual orientation, and culture that advance the success of people in education as well as in business and health. And her primary research interest is on how societal norms and stereotypes undermine or support individuals' motivational experience. And her research is grounded in experimental design and longitudinal survey methodology to advance the success of underrepresented people in education, the workplace, and health. So I'm really excited, and I'm sure a lot of you are too. Her work just has so many broad implications for broadening participation in STEM, from what happens in our classrooms, our research laboratories, our lab classes, to the way we hire people. In fact, some of her recent work on hiring practices has resulted in changes in the hiring practices of Montana State. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Okay, and so she also runs the Motivation and Diversity Research Lab at MSU and has over $5 million in external funding from the NIH and NSF, is the PI of multiple externally funded projects, including the Advanced Project Tracks, which aims to broaden participation of women faculty in STEM and social and behavioral sciences at MSU in Bozeman. And so I could obviously keep going, but I'll let Dr. Smith take over and share with us her work today. And please join us for some questions after. And then there's also opportunity to stay here and just have an informal chat with Dr. Smith after her talk. So thank you so much for joining us today, and please welcome me in.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I really appreciate it. I'm going to do my best to talk about, as Lisa mentioned, different points in the process through which you can think about some of the work that we do and how it applies to various situations. I want to sort of contextualize this with data that won't surprise anybody here about the participation looking first at gender within the biological and social sciences. And you can see biology as a general field, biological sciences, does a pretty good job. So the data, when we look at underrepresented minority women, are much more telling. Notice the graph doesn't even go beyond 20%, right? So what this says is we need to pay attention not only to gender, we need to pay attention to intersectionality. And I want to return to this point towards the end of the conversation today. Many people talk about this metaphor of the pipeline. And it works, but it's limited because, of course, it suggests that we can do one of two things. We can focus on the water, which is primarily what people pay attention to. These are the students, right? So how much water can we put in the pipe? And if we put more people in, then even though it's still leaking, more people will still come out. So that's one option. And we talk about the skills, the goals, and the values of the students and how we can shove more in through the pipeline. Or we could talk about the pipe and how that's structured and what that looks like, and what we'll talk about today, which are these norms within science or STEM more broadly that might be contributing to this underrepresentation problem. So here's what I want to focus in on today. I want to talk about disrupting some norms within science. And if this makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, then we're on the right track. Because, of course, norms by definition are a comfort place. They're familiar. There's the way we've always done things. I want to talk about the norms about who is a bioscientist, what makes a good bioscientist, and what is bioscience even for. Let's talk about for example, a physicist, but you, I think, can easily replace this with a bioscientist or an engineer. But if we focus for a second on just the ideal worker norms of what is a scientist, things like they're self and success focused, they work all the time. Even while I was walking over here, 2 people had to peel off because they had to go set up their experiment, or did they even make it back? Right? Like the science is constantly happening at any and all times. This person has innate, natural, gifted talent. They're very brilliant. They're driven by a quest for knowledge. They definitely aren't taking time off, right?Ey're not taking time off for caregiving, whatever that may be. They're assertive, they're risk-taking, they ask for what they need. What does this sound like? Right? These are the qualities that we associate masculinity with. And I'm gonna be honest, this person sounds awesome. I absolutely want this person working in my research lab, right? I'm gonna get a lot of work out of this person. And there's nothing wrong with this, but if this is the norm, these masculinity norms result in some pretty important things that if we don't pause and look at, can actually perpetuate the cycle. And so there's what we would call in the social psychological literature unintentional gender bias, sometimes called implicit bias, unconscious bias. It's all the same thing. People just can't agree on what to call it. I like to call it unintentional gender bias because it's not intentional. As soon as people are aware that they might have a bias or be stereotyping someone, generally, for the most part, people want to stop doing that. So it's unintentional, and I think that's important. Some research that came out that we got really excited about, a good friend of mine, Corinne Mossberg-Kuzin, and Joe Handelsman and her team, they did something remarkable. For the longest time, faculty assumed that the rest of the lay people were biased, right? Because faculty are objective scientists that are only influenced by the facts in front of them. And it's true, most of the research up until this point had been on undergraduates or people in the community and business folks. So, real people were biased, but scientists are not. And so this was a remarkable study because they asked faculty from biology, physics, and chemistry, 127 faculty from Research One universities, maybe even somebody here from this university would have participated. And what they did is they sent them an application for a lab manager. And the resume was always the same. And what they said is, we are looking at getting some input on mentoring of the student. We're considering hiring the student at our university. We want to get some external feedback. And tell us what you think about this applicant. Should we hire them? If so, how much should we pay them? And would you be willing to mentor this person so that they can move up from post-bac lab manager kind of thing to the next step in the pipeline? So they sent out this resume to all these faculty across the nation in the United States, and this is in 2012. The resume either had the name Jennifer or it had the name John. Otherwise, it was identical. The exact same resume was sent out. And here's what they found. John versus Jennifer. John was seen as significantly more competent. As a potential lab manager, he was seen as significantly more hireable. And faculty were willing to mentor John much more so than Jennifer. The exact same resume, 2012, science faculty. Incredibly powerful. One more fun piece of data. They asked them, okay, if we do hire this person, how much should we pay? Jennifer was offered $3,000 less. The exact same resume, $3,000 less. And just for fun, let me bring it home for you. Right? So we're contributing, right? We all heard about the pay gap and all of that. This is part of that process. Now, what's really important here is in this research, they have found that it doesn't matter if the faculty member was male or female. This is not blaming anybody. Everybody equally held these biases, right? Just the name, John, Jennifer. So it wasn't that women were really nice to this person or particularly harsh to the female. That wasn't it. Faculty gender did not predict anything. Everybody held these biases. So this was really important. It was published in PNAS, and it really set off a huge explosion of people doing research in academia and in the scientific community about the role of gender bias and the ways in which it comes about. So here's just a short list of the different ways in which gender bias has been shown very recently in the literature. Everything from your teacher ratings to how letters of references, who gets cited, the scholarly quality of a conference abstract. So really convincing that something is going on. So we at Montana State University wanted to, with this knowledge in mind, disrupt this process, right? So if you're thinking of all of those things about what is a scientist, how can we intervene in that process to disrupt that norm? Can we change the norms about who is a scientist and make it bigger and broader so that a scientist can be anybody? All right, first question, where is Montana? There's your geography lesson, Bozeman, Montana. We are well known because we are 90 minutes away, not miles, 90 minutes away from Yellowstone National Park. To the south and to the north, we have the beautiful Glacier National Park. So if you want to come visit, this is what you get to see. It's a fantastic place. It's full of its own stereotypes, right? So people are like, Jessi rides her horse to work, obviously, and wears cowboy. I do wear cowboy boots, but this is the work we're about to show you. If we can do this in Montana, I think there's incredibly ripe possibilities at other universities that don't already start with you're in a rural community that only has 30,000 people in it, right? So this, as Lisa mentioned, I'm the PI on what's called Advanced Project Tracks. It's sponsored by the National Science Foundation with the very lofty goal to change the culture of Montana State University in 5 years for $5 million. Go. Okay, so what we do, and the reason that I'm part of this as the PI, right, as a social psychologist who studies biases and motivation, we come everything through a theoretical lens with hypothesis testing. And I can't emphasize that enough. This is not a kitchen sink, just try a bunch of stuff, things that sound good and it'll probably work and see what sticks. This is a systematic research project. We use self-determination theory, which is a classic theory in psychology, that talks about if you can foster the psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which are what they are, and I'll show you the definition in a minute. For women, we should be able to actually help everybody. So it's sort of, we can focus in on this group of STEM faculty women, tenure track faculty, that's important, and do it in a way that actually fosters excellence for everyone, where everybody benefits. So with this in mind, here's what it looked like in Montana State when we got this grant in 2012. We had 33 departments, 17 of them are in STEM. That spans 9 colleges. 3 of those colleges are STEM, College of Agriculture, College of Engineering, and the College of Science. At the time, we had 472 tenure track faculty. So this is a very small, relatively small campus compared to here. And you saw the list of the departments that we have there. At Montana State, 17% of our STEM faculty were women. Compared to nationally, that data were 34%. Interestingly, I know many of you here are in biology. Our microbiology department had 1 female faculty out of the 10 faculty on it. And yet the student body was much like you would expect from those earlier data. It was about 50% women, right? So it doesn't represent, not only were we behind anyway, but we were even behind a national indicator of what that looked like. So using self-determination theory, which says these 3 needs, the great thing about this theory and a lot about psychology is we name things what they sound like. So there's nothing tricky here. I'm not trying to pull a fast one. Competence is competence, feelings of relatedness, and feelings of autonomy. And we know from decades of research that these are related to really important things. and job satisfaction, trust and loyalty within an organization, students' motivation and creativity, performance, all of these really good well-being things. It's a very well-established theory. We wanted to see, could we design an intervention with this in mind to actually disrupt the norm of who gets hired in STEM? So we developed an intervention based on this. The first thing we wanted to do was to enhance the autonomy of the search committee and show them that these unintentional biases interfere with their decision making. Right? So if you had true autonomy, you're in charge of your decision making. And what we're saying, actually these things that you don't even realize how these stereotypes are impacting you. And so we wanted to do that. How easy does that sound? How the heck do you convince STEM faculty that everyone is prone to unintentional bias? So the first thing I did is I went around and I started talking about that paper that I just showed you about John and Jennifer, thinking this is it, they got the data, they'll be totally convinced, you can't refute it, it's so simple a study. Guess what they could do? Totally refute it, right? They poked holes in all kinds of ways in that study, and then I would say, yeah, but what about these 18 other studies that showed this other, oh, no, there was a problem this way, this was the problem. And they were correct, right? Any one study can be picked apart methodologically speaking, but on a whole, it was very surprising. This resistance to understanding and accepting the data. So what we did a study on this and published, which we found, okay, the evidence is clearly not enough. It's a starting point. We want to talk about the data, that's important, but it's not enough. Because any one study can be refuted and people have a lot of motivation to poke holes in it because it seems threatening. What was fascinating, right, is remember, nobody was saying men are responsible for this, shame on, it was, no, men and women equally hold these biases. And of course they do. Because when you think scientist, you probably think, like people do when we ask them to draw a picture of a scientist, a white guy. You're statistically correct. You're correct. Yes, if you thought woman and you thought nurse, statistically speaking, your brain is doing wonderful things for you, right? So it's not to be blamed. But what do you notice? So this is, you ask people, draw a picture of a scientist. I think this one's ambiguously gendered. I like the androgyny going on here. They all, though, have glasses. Even that guy. Can't see. They all have lab coats, white lab coats, not very attractive, right? It's bizarre that Einstein is still around. What else do you notice? Bad hair. They're alone. They're all chemists. That is not science. People think scientists, not only do they think, even Einstein actually wasn't a chemist, right? It's funny how science means chemistry lab. And that is important because, of course, science happens everywhere, right? In the field, it happens in all different kinds of labs, in all different kinds of settings. So it's not just the norm about who is a scientist, but how does science get done? It gets done alone in a lab with some beakers, with your ugly hair and your glasses and your lab coat. Right, so we start by, so I would share this with faculty and then take them through an experience and say, let's experience this together so that you can see how this feels for you. So show them the data and then take them through this experience. So if you will bear with me, I want to take you through this experience just like we would do with faculty at Montana State University. So to do this, you're going to need to take things away from your lap. You're going to need access to your legs. I will help you through this. Trust me on this. It's like 2 o'clock. You can do this. It's exams week. What's going to happen is words are going to appear on the screen, and you are going to need to know your right hand from your left hand. So work that out right now. And depending on which side the word gets categorized into, and I'm going to take you through some examples. We're going to go through some trials, some training. You want to be as quick and accurate as possible. So let me show you exactly what this looks like. Okay, so left hand, if it's a science word, left hand, you're going to hit your left knee. If it's an art word, you're going to hit your right knee. So for example, let me put one up there. I'm not going to trick you either. I'm not going to throw up something like architecture, like, I'm not going to fool you here. Okay, so let me show you one more. Okay, so that's what you're going to do, all right? So we're going to do some practice first. Okay, so here we go. That's going to go quicker than this, but here we go. Okay, right? Easy, you got this. So now, same thing, except for if the word is masculine, left hand. If the word is feminine, right hand. Again, not gonna like throw you, I'm not gonna put up trans and see what you do. Really simple words. Let me do one together. Okay? All right, so here's how this, let's do this one now. Perfect. All right, so the first test. The exact same words you just saw, the exact same knees are involved. If the same words you just saw are science or masculine, same thing, you just practice this, left hand. If they are feminine or arts, you're going to hit your right knee. All right, so here we go. Perfect. All right, so we're going to change one thing, but we're going to do a training with this, so get you used to it. We're going to leave, we're going to just switch the hands. So the same words you just saw, hers and mother and all of that, it's now going to go on your left hand, and the masculine words will go on your right hand. So we want to get your brain and your body used to doing that, so we're going to go ahead and do that same sequence again just to get you used to the other side, okay? All right, you're almost there. Hang on, it's so close to done. All right, we're changing. Science and arts are where we left them. We've done, those are the same. Feminine is what you just practiced. With masculine is what you just practiced. Same exact words. All right, here we go. You should see your faces right now. You're like, please, is it almost over? Oh my God, how many more? Right? So how did that feel? Which one's easier? Right? The first one is easier. This is the first one. The reason it's psychologically easier is essentially you're keeping one thing in mind. You can memorize it. This is typically harder, maybe not always, but especially for people who've just come to see a talk on diversity and gender and STEM. So imagine if we just like pulled out random people and asked them to do this, right? So there's a selection bias in even you being here today. But this is typically harder, usually because you're trying to keep different things in mind. Now, in the real research where you do this, they manipulate which order, whether you're right-handed or left-handed. They counterbalance which, if you do the masculine words first or what, so they take into account all of this. It's called the implicit associations test.
So have you ever given the seminar where you flipped them?
Yes.
So you do the science or feminine first?
Mm-hmm.
And what are people's responses?
People then complain that they didn't understand the task well enough, right? So that they just didn't know the instructions. So that's an important, they absolutely do that, but you want people to feel like they get it. They're getting the hang of this task, so you do those trainings. Otherwise, they'll say, this was hard for me, but it was hard for me because I didn't know what the task was.
Don't you, in the first part of your talk, you actually set it up for people to be biased for women not being in science or not being in STEM. So are you not just playing on the bias that you established from the beginning of your talk?
Precisely. That's precisely the point. We want to have an experience where you can say, if women are underrepresented in STEM, and here are the data on it, and let me show you how it is easier to make this association than this one.
What I'm saying is that if you switch the seminar around and you start by, let's talking about biology at UCSD, where for the last 15 years, we've been 50-50, and start off by saying there is no gender bias, and then flip it around, do you actually get, I mean, so...
It still happens. This is incredibly difficult to change. I could give it to you again right this second, and it will feel the same way. Now, Trish Devine and other people who do work on this show that it's a habit that's very hard to break. It's possible with lots of training. These associations, and so the short answer to your question is absolutely. They changed the priming. They've had a woman give it versus a man give it. They'll do this with race and ethnicity, setting it, all those different things have been taken, this has been done for years, and they do it much better than this. They do it with to the millisecond on how fast people are. But the point really is just to set an experience for faculty and students to take pause, and you know for yourself how hard or easy that was. Or my favorite is when I get a big group and people just start cheating and they start hitting both knees. Like that's really fun. Or they do this, you know. And so it's just an experiential piece that's meant to start these conversations. And to point out that everybody, even those, myself, I study this. I consider myself someone who's very knowledgeable about this. And the second one's harder for me too. And we also pair this with one more thing. We say, this is a very difficult habit to break. Because, for example, breakfast cereals. Like, where am I going with this? Nearly, in fact, all breakfast cereal characters are men, are male. Even the weird shredded wheat thing, Snap, Crackle, and Pop, really? Not even one of them? It's bizarre. Think about it. I challenge you to go to the store and find a female. You'll be like, strawberry shortcake. That was not a good cereal, and that did not last long, right? So these messages about gender are just part of our culture. Nobody's to blame here, but we should acknowledge this is really easy to do. Let me show you this. If I said, okay, take your time, I want you to go slow, and I want you to do this. You'd be like, you will get it right 100% of the time, right? If you slow down, this is easy. That's the whole point. If you slow down, how many faculty and students and postdocs in here just go about your days totally slow? None of you. None of you. That is not the culture of academia, right? We are constantly rushing, constantly going quickly. So if you slow down, the biases are, the associations, you can overcome that and take your time and you'll get it right every time. But they're very hard to break. So one other way to show how hard this habit is to break, if you think of it as a habit, what I want you to do is name the color of the font, okay? Just yell it out. Here we go.
Brown. Red. Green. Black. Orange.
Which ones were harder? Yeah, like that's what that sounded like to me. And orange. Grange, right? Because our habit is to read. And if you go slow, if I took my time, and actually my trick is I just take my glasses off and I can't read it. If you take your time and you have a strategy, you're like, I'm gonna squint, or I'm just gonna look at the last letter, you can overcome that habit. But these habits are hard to break. And that is the whole point, is to set this up as an experience for faculty to say, even though you want to be objective and consider yourself objective, if you're going quickly, that's where biases can come in. And so we want to slow down. So we take them through all of that as number one. We also give them a toolkit that we've created that has tips and strategies pulled mostly from the University of Wisconsin, which had one of the very first advanced grants, that tells people how to do a broad, active search for diverse people. So it turns out if you just place your ad in Science and the Chronicle of Higher Ed and walk away, you'll get applications. But if you post your job ad in new places, if you reach out to people personally and invite them to apply, that goes an incredible. So these kinds of very specific how to word your ad, where to put it, how to do the review process. Faculty there's students in here too, you'll know, like we aren't trained as HR people, right? We're scientists. We aren't, if you're a student or a grad student or a postdoc, like what, did you take a class in how to hire people, like the HR rule? No, right? It's a shock when you get into academia and you're on a search committee and you have someone's life in their hands and you're like, oh my God. Right? But we expect faculty to just go in and become part of the search process and to pick a candidate, and they don't know how to do this. Nobody's trained them. So we're trying to give them these tips and tools and strategies and enhance their competence around this. And then the final thing we did is we enhanced the relatedness of the committee in 2 ways. One was they got a peer, a faculty peer, who could take them through their questions that they had in the search process, help them find where to place that ad, those kinds of things. So it was a very relatedness process. And we also had faculty, when they were job candidates on campus, they met with another faculty member completely confidentially outside of the area. In this case, for the STEM searches, this person was in political science, a faculty member in political science, who talked to the candidate about work-life stuff. Do you have a partner? Do you have questions about the school system, elderly care? Do you have pets? What are your, faculty on search training, we don't treat you like people. You're just a resume. You are your vita. And if you're like, oh my God, she appears to be pregnant, don't look, don't make eye contact at her belly, right? That's what we're trained to do. But if facts, and there's reasons for that. And HR will tell you, you'll get sued if you ask them questions about their family. But a confidential, safe place where job candidates can ask the questions they want to ask, because they aren't going to come to your university. If they have a partner and it's a deal breaker, they will not come if their partner is not also hired, right? They need to have an opportunity to talk about that as an option, for example. So with those 3 things in mind, what we did is we did a randomized field experiment, blocked it by college. We had 23 STEM searches happening in 1 academic year, and we randomly assigned them to their typical HR training or our training. And we ruled out several alternative explanations. The random assignment took care of these, but we ruled them out anyway. And then what we found is, compared to searches in the no intervention conditions, searches that received our training, phone interviewed significantly more women, on campus interviewed a significantly greater proportion of women. They were 6.3 times more likely to make an offer to a woman candidate faculty member in STEM, and she was nearly 6 times more likely to accept the offer if they were in our intervention group. So we think this means our intervention was effective in broadening the participation of women faculty in STEM, and this is what our data looked like when we started and where we are now. Now, it's still not great at the university level. We've published these results in BioScience. If you're interested, and all of our materials are freely available. But think about how this applies to if you're hiring a lab manager, if you're hiring an instructional assistant, an undergraduate research assistant. These kinds of things aren't just unique to faculty hiring. So there's ways to think about how that applies to other areas that you're working in. Okay, so if we can expand who is a bioscientist and who gets hired, the next question becomes, what makes a good bioscientist? What are the criteria there? And as I mentioned, this innate talent, this stereotype that men, for example, are much more naturally gifted at math and science, where women are gifted, but they have to try really hard, they have to put a lot of effort. That's the stereotype. And it turns out the national level stereotypes on a nation level predict achievement gaps in math. And we translate this to what we call stereotype threat, or social identity threat theory, which says that if you are that person, if you are a woman, if you're an underrepresented minority, you don't believe the stereotype, you know it's not true, but there's this burden, this worry, this fear, this concern that people are going to see me through that lens. And that puts an extra burden on you. And this can, in fact, impact minority women students' motivation and performance. So classic example of this, students take a difficult math test. For some, they're asked to mark their little bubble sheet with their student ID, and then they put their name, and they put their gender, and some other stuff. And if they do mark their gender before the test, Men significantly outperform women on the math exam. This was the SAT. Whereas if they did it after, you saw statistically equal performance for men and women. What's interesting is ETS still struggles with this, right? ETS still really wants you to fill out your demographics first. And we're like, just put it at the end. My dissertation work replicated this in a number of ways, and one way is within computer science, looking at motivation. So that was performance, same kind of thing. If women mark their gender before working on a computer science programming task, they really don't like it very much. They don't want to do it ever again. But if they did it afterwards, they were much more interested in learning more about computer science as a major and working in a computer science programming task. A glimpse again at the evidence. Stereotype threats come out. It's not just circling your gender. There are many ways in which this comes out. You could just be in the minority, like the numerical minority in your classroom or your study group. You could just be interacting with an outgroup member. The test could be described as it's importantly high stakes, it's difficult, it's your final exam perhaps. Instructions about don't make any mistakes, someone cracks a joke. I mean, any number of ways can trigger stereotype threat. In fact, it's overwhelming. You're like, great, we're gonna have to live in a bubble. How are we gonna make this better? It's hard. And there's no one right way, one simple solution to alleviate stereotype threat. Some interesting work, though, on thinking about space and the educational learning environment that we have set for students. And I would argue, should change the norms for where science education even takes place. So one example, continuing in the computer science example, was Sapna and Cheryan had undergraduates come into a computer science classroom. So it was in the building, it was in a computer science building. They went to one of two classrooms, one that's set up with very stereotypical items, and she did all this pre-testing to find out that apparently Star Trek screams computer science. There was other things, video games, wires everywhere, and non-stereotypical items, nature stuff, right? So still males in the posters, but nature stuff, in magazines and this kind of thing. And what she found is, in that room, they did this computer science task. Students were then asked to rate their interest in this major. They were all freshmen, undeclared majors for the most part, some sophomores. And women's interest in computer science was the same. It elevated to the same level of men when they were in this, I'm going to call it the nature room, right? So if you think about, we don't even probably pay attention, but go back to your classroom, go back to your lab, go back to your faculty office and ask yourself, like, on accident, am I conveying a message that maybe I don't even mean to convey? At Montana State, we took a look around. This is our computer science lab before. It spells out Windows with CD disks and Linux, right? I mean, this is what it looked like. And then based on this research, this is what it looks like now. So it's all in its Japanese motif of nature, round desks. It's and guess what? Everybody likes this room better, right? So this is just one example to inspire you to think about how is your lab structured? And it's unintentional, and it's just the norms. Labs have always looked like this. Classrooms have always looked like this. So we don't even think to ask ourselves, does it have to look like this? Maybe not. So finally, what is bioscience for? All right, so who do we hire? What's the learning and working environment that they're in? And then at the end of the day, what is it for? Why are we even doing science? Research shows us that across the lifespan, from little kids all the way up, people believe science is a very lonely job. It's self-focused, you're by yourself in your lab. It's probably not true. Like, I was just talking to somebody today, like, people publish with 15 co-authors now, right? But even then, the perception is that you all did your piece alone in your lab and then, like, put it together in a manuscript. All people, all men, majority men too, but especially women, first generation, Latino and Native American students, prefer jobs that have the potential to give back, to have a big impact, to be something bigger than themselves, and where people collaborate and work together. So based on a theory called goal congruity theory, which Amanda Diekman and others started thinking about this topic, which is that certain groups might be underrepresented in STEM because of this value. They want to work collaboratively and be part of something bigger and give back to their community, but they don't think STEM does that. So we could argue it's a stereotype that unfortunately STEM has. It's not true, but that's the perception. So the idea is if what you want out of your job matches what you think the job does, that's fantastic. You're going to be more motivated. You're going to want to have a career in that. That makes perfect sense. But so does the fact that if what you want out of a job and what the job you think offers, they don't match up, that's going to be bad for you wanting to go pursue that job. It's very simple. It's very intuitive. So we wanted to test this, thinking about how big picture, how giving back particular fields are. And so this is a cartoon that talks about the progression or the evolution of purity within fields. And I have mapped on for you the percentage of women faculty in various fields, right? So I'm in psychology. Many of you are probably in biology, so, and isn't that interesting? There's a version of this cartoon that has mathematics, like over here, which is also fun. But the idea being that the smarter, more pure, more basic science rigor is that innate talent, right? And that, interestingly, maps very well on to predicting the proportion of women and underrepresented people in the field. So this is getting at this notion of STEM not being very communal, right? It doesn't involve working with other people. It doesn't involve the community. It's not about giving back at all. It's, and Amanda's work shows that this is the case. So if we have communal goals, how does it involve working with and helping other people? STEM falls very short on that. Compared to past male stereotypic things like lawyers and doctors, there was a time that those were very male-dominated, and there's been a shift into the extent to which that might be related to lawyers as giving back and as doing common good kind of work. So that's the assumption here. Well, we realized quite quickly that people don't like the word communal. And especially in STEM, there's a lot of, what is this feminine word that you've cast upon me? There's a knee-jerk reaction to thinking it sounds soft. You're suggesting everybody has to be applied. That's not okay. So we've had to come at this, because psychologically we mean communal, working with and helping other people. But we've had to come at this in a different way so that we don't get that kind of resistance. And we started thinking about this work on Pasteur's Quadrant, right? So the idea is, what is the use of the thing that you're working on scientifically? And does it involve a search for a fundamental understanding? And so the quadrant here, that's Pasteur's Quadrant, is what called use-inspired basic research. So pasteurizing milk, his daughter needed pasteurized milk. He did this for his daughter, so it was use-inspired. But that process of pasteurizing is incredibly important for so many other things, right? So it's use-inspired. So we've started talking about the communal utility value, the purpose. Why are you doing this? As a use-inspired, it can still be basic research. It's still thinking about the processes. But what's the bigger picture? Does it in any way, shape, or form, someday, somehow, even in the distant future, make an impact? And chances are, especially within biological science, the answer is yes, right? Mostly, somehow, public health or the environment, otherwise nobody would get grant money, right? You don't get taxpayer dollars to just think, which would be awesome, actually. But we have to think about this stereotype that basic science does not involve working with or at all giving back or caring about other people. Because it's not true, but that's a stereotype. So how do students' communal goals, how much they want that out of their jobs, out of their science, what does that do? How does that factor into their research experience? So we set about this with a couple of research questions. Does thinking that science research provides opportunities to work with and help other people, so that communal utility goal, does it actually predict more research involvement in the lab as for research assistants, and does it predict their career interests? And is this especially true for underrepresented minority students? That's the goal congruity theory. And does it still work even if we account for all sorts of important other goals, like your passion for learning, your interest in just understanding problem solving, your desire to get a job that pays well, which, by the way, is not for science. Newsflash, if you're going into academia for the bucks, good luck. we approached it by having undergraduate research assistants who are working in biomedical faculty labs as our participants. At this point in the process, we had, as you can see, about 340 undergraduate students from 2 universities at the time and 7 tribal colleges. And what we were trying to look at, one of them was at Cal State Long Beach, which is where my colleague Dustin Thulman was at, and for Latinos. And then, of course, we wanted to include Native American students as well in Montana. So this is our sample. We gave them a survey as they sort of started. These are in semester systems. As they started into the research experience, they're research assistants. And then we followed them up about the end of that semester, and then we kept following them for up to 2 years. And we started by testing our assumption. Is it true that URM students value communal, working with and helping other people? Is that true? All this other research had found it before, but did we replicate it? And we said, people look for different things, where it is important to you. They started off by asking them their intrinsic goals, their passion, desire for learning, that they're motivated just because they enjoy the experience. And everybody, URM students and white students, say that they believe that science does this. They get that out of science. What we did replicate was for URM students, we called it altruistic in this case. They wanted a job that provided opportunities for them to work with and help other people. So this is important. So all the students are motivated for intrinsic motivation to enjoy the process and the experience, but in particular, our URM students really want a job that allows them to give back and work with other people. Okay, so does that matter? If they thought the science they were doing, the biomedical research that they were doing in the lab, which, by the way, I shared this at lunch, I think the most important thing that they do as science research assistants, what is your guess? If they're washing dishes. Yeah, they're taking out the garbage, or they're cleaning, which is fantastic. Like, that's the most frequently cited thing that a research assistant does. So how do you get from my job as someone who washes dishes and takes out the trash to how I'm working with and giving back and being part of some larger scientific process? And sometimes faculty and postdocs and lab managers don't do a very good job of filling the students in on that, right? They're like, here's your task. This is what you're in charge of. And it's very small, without stepping back and saying, this is part of a bigger picture project. If the students did see that their science that they were doing gave opportunities to give back and help other people, they were more likely to be involved, to say that they felt more involved, they lost track of time, they really got into the research experience more often, and they were more likely to say that they wanted to go on with a career in science. So what we take away from this is that having greater communal utility value, if you can see that as a research assistant, this contributes to URM student motivation above and beyond that intrinsic motivation that was there. So another way to show this to you as a path, right? So if you think that science affords you opportunities to give back and help other people, this predicts for URM students how involved, psychologically involved they feel in their research at the end of the semester, and that predicts how much they're interested in a career. It doesn't hurt the white students are not suffering. It just doesn't matter. But it's particularly helping our underrepresented minority students. And so this was also published in BioScience, if you're curious about looking into the details of the method and so on and so forth. But with that in mind, so what can we do? How can we change the perception that science is lonely and self-centered and just about basic research that has no downstream implications? How can we do that? So we can add utility value. So in the classroom, in your research lab, as faculty, as students, we can actually go in and help add this value to the learning process. So one way to do this is our colleague at University of Wisconsin-Madison, Judith Herikevich, has been looking at how to create class assignments, and she uses biology as the class in which she does this at Wisconsin, to look at, can you add utility value into the course assignments? Can you get students, force them to think about about what they're doing. And the first thing, I'll show you an example of what she does, is she has students, there's 3 essays that they write throughout the quarter, and they're topic-based. They're tied to the unit, and through random assignment, they're either talking about the relevance, the utility of the topic that they're studying in class right then, or they're summarizing the material. So they're engaging with the material in both cases, and then they're asked to write these essays. Now, fun anecdote is that the students get upset when you tell them to write in biology. This blows their mind. So be prepared if you're ready to do this kind of work. It's also important that it's 3 doses, right? So it's not an extra thing, it's graded. It's not a huge part of their grade, but it's counted. It's seen as integrated into the class. It's not busy work. And it's also important that they get an example, because science students are not trained to think about how something is relevant, or they're used to regurgitating the right answer for the test, and they're not used to thinking about how this helps. Giving an example is essential. So at Wisconsin, they use Bucky Badger, but you can think of creative examples to set the stage to help guide the students on how something might be relevant. So what did she find? First generation underrepresented minority students in biology. So she did uncouple this research with looking at continuing generation majority students compared to first gen underrepresented minority students. If they completed these 3 writing assignments, discussing the relevance and usefulness of biology, which we're calling the utility value intervention, for first generation students in the control group, this is how many words they wrote on their essay. So you can see that this is the significant difference here. First generation students asked to write about the utility value are writing longer essays, even though the requirements are the same for everybody. They only have to write a certain number of words. They're engaging with the material more. That's interesting in of itself. But what's really fascinating is that these students were getting the equally highest grades as everybody else. But those first generation students who were just asked to summarize the material were still having this deficit. Right? So something like integrating into your curriculum assignments that force students to think about the broader impacts or the translational impact, the language we use around grant writing for their science, can have really positive effects on the most at-risk group of students. Another way to add utility value is in how we communicate our research. So maybe you have like a research fair on campus, or I'm sure you're presenting at conferences, here, there, and everywhere, and someplace where you write an abstract, right? So much of our world in science revolves around writing abstracts. It's how you decide whether to read the rest of the paper, right? Like, be honest, right? You don't be like, I'm just gonna skip the abstract and go right into the intro. Nobody does that, right? The abstract is essential. So we took actual abstracts that had been published, and this is just one example. We had several. And we took the abstract and we manipulated whether or not it drew attention to the fact that it was a team effort. This is really hard to see, but it talks about how they worked in their team. And then we added, whether the software can be reconfigured for functions such as children and helping with prosthetics and things like this. Or we talked about whether it could be used and it helps soldiers who are injured in combat, so it has some applied value. The science doesn't change. The content of the science is the same. All we've done is added some information on the big picture usefulness of this topic, potentially, and we added in whether or not it was a team-based approach or whether it was a prestigious, like this is award-winning research. And it turned out that adding just that piece of information about giving back and working with other people, we untangled them. We tried one of each separately. Turns out you need both. That information, students read this abstract and thought, science actually seems pretty like something that involves working with and helping other people. So that's good. That's what we aim to do. And the more they thought, just like our other study, that science does that, the more motivation they had to be a research assistant in the future, and the more positive they were about a science career. These were freshmen and sophomores. Our first study I showed you was like undergraduates who were research assistants, which are more juniors and seniors, right? So at both points in the process, infusing that utility value about how science really is about collaborative team science. It's about having some sort of opportunity, however distant, to give back and work with other people. So in summary, what have we, I hope that you've learned today, is to create these new norms within STEM. We need to break the bias habit, and it's hard. And you have to set an intention, and you have to go slow. And we need to consider diverse people as imperative to advancing science. This is that focus on the pipe instead of the water. So in other words, we don't want to just create a place where science is full of gay people and brown people and all kinds of diverse people who had to assimilate into the existing culture of science and are actually very much just look like everybody else, right? To have a truly diverse science, we want actually different ways of thinking and different ways of knowing, and that's what's going to make interesting problem solving, right? So that's critical. We also want to reduce those stereotype threat triggers. Sometimes it's not possible. If you have a class and you're putting people into small groups and there's only 4 African American students in your class of 300, right? These are hard things to think about, but we know that that experience can trigger stereotype threat. And so taking a look around the environment that you're creating, how your test is structured, how ways in which you don't even see, so set an intention to actually just look around and see how you're structuring and what stereotypes might be operating that you don't even realize. And then, of course, conveying the possible use-inspired communal utility value of science. So when you write your abstracts, when you talk to your students, when you are thinking about your assignments, when you're thinking about your research, asking yourself, even though I'm only doing this protein assay, and that's my job, how does it fit into a bigger picture of science, right? And how does my job connect with this other person's job who's washing the dishes from the stuff that I just made a mess from, for example? With this all said, we just wrote a paper talking about how really transforming the culture of science necessarily means paying attention to all of those things. This isn't easy. If it were easy, we would have done this by now. And we argue that although I've mostly focused on, I focused a little bit on women, then we had URM students and some first generation students, right? There's a lot of different intersecting identities happening. And changes that bring about inclusion for one group can absolutely have far-reaching benefits for everyone. The faculty at Montana State University, even though all of our programs are factored in around women in STEM, the men are absolutely also taking advantage of and benefiting from things like dual career accommodations and having a chance to talk to the family advocate and work-life integration and these kinds of things. So what we do for one group, even though you might think it seems short-sighted because we've missed an important group, can actually start the hard work of transforming the culture. So with that soapbox said, I want to, of course, thank my collaborators. Dustin Thoman is here and is down the street from you guys at San Diego State University, and my colleagues with Advance, and also Judy Harakevich at Wisconsin. So with that, I do have references if you want them, some selected references I can put back up, but I'll stop here and take some questions. Yeah.
Completely that there are cultural differences, that how people view science is very dependent upon their cultural background. Mm-hmm. I also agree that that we do a very poor job of having students, especially in grammar school and high school, understand the value of science in relationship to, let's say, the human experience. But on one issue you were mentioning, I'm not sure I agree. I think the vast majority of individuals, say like myself, that have gone into science do it not because of the possibility of solving problems for humanity, but because of a keen interest and excitement in solving specific problems. So I think that at some level I understand the importance, just generally, of making key points about how science helps people. I mean, when I talk to individuals, potential donors or whatever that aren't in science, and they want to know why should they give to a basic science department, and then you explain what key discoveries have been in this department and how they have changed human quality of life, they view it in a different case. But in relationship to many of us in the room and probably majority of my colleagues, we didn't start going into this, I think, because, you know, I wanted to cure humanity. I did it because it was cool. I mean,
Absolutely.
I thought it was exciting.
So you're
The linkage between, you know, and your error bars sort of indicate it wasn't a huge amount of difference between minorities, URMs, and other individuals in relationship to, you know, wanting to, you know, cure and help humanity. I'm not sure that point is not just a general societal point, rather than being, quote, part of the responsibility as to why there are fewer URMs. I think that may have to do with, I mean, a number of years ago, I spent time, went to underrepresented minority colleges and tried to encourage kids. But they viewed a college professor as someone who was basically poor and, you know, was up in front of the class, giving, you know, boring lectures, in contrast to someone that did exciting work. So I think that had to do with, in some places, people want to get out of a socioeconomic situation, and they don't view science
as a way to
as
do
being
that.
a mechanism of achieving that goal, although if you talk to majority of STEM faculty at the University of California, most people would sort of not say they have low income.
Okay, so you raise a great question, and this model actually addresses your question. So your question is I think several parts, but the main question was to what extent that we think about this passion for problem solving and discovery, just generally by itself. These data take into account the amount of intrinsic interest as a goal for what you want out of science. So in other words,
those numbers are essentially
that's right, exactly. So it's exactly what you described. Underrepresented students and majority group students all want and enjoy the process of learning and discovery. They all have a passion for that. When we take that into account, this communal value, the communal utility value, this is showing that path even after removing the variance accounted for by your intrinsic interest and passion for discovery. So above and beyond, that's what's key here, above and beyond people's, and it's high for everybody, level of interest in discovery of science, communal goals adds something more. And it's predictive over time. This data only goes out to time 2. As I said, we've got data going out for 2 years, right? So it is the case that yes, all students, our data support this. I have other data with Native American students who are in STEM and for freshmen. All students value highly, and we also have work on agency goals, which is extrinsic goals, things like having money, having a prestigious job, being able to be elevated in socioeconomic status. We can control and account for those goals and how they're operating, and we still find that communal utility value adds something extra. When you say, why do they keep dropping out? Everything else seems in place. This might be the thing. right? So we control for, we ask students, and you're absolutely right, that's all over the place in terms of what people's values and goals are, but what we find is there's pretty good uniformity. Everybody really, the science students, particularly in this study who are research assistants, they have a passion for understanding science, and they are interested in jobs, and we ask them, what do you want out of this experience? Some of the times they tell us, I want a letter of reference so I can go to graduate school. Absolutely, but students who are URM students are much more likely to be motivated and influenced and stay and be retained if they can also see the utility value of science. We are not asking or suggesting in any way, shape, or form. That's why those abstracts, I think, are critical. The science didn't change. You're still doing the exact same science. All you're doing is helping articulate, like you would for a donor or for alumni, to potential scientists who haven't yet totally formed their science identity, who are still figuring out what is science about. And ultimately, they might absolutely end up as academic researchers who don't think about that anymore at all. But at that early development of interest stage, where they're trying to figure out, what is my identity as a scientist? Do I want to go on? Is this a career for me? And we know that Latino and Native American students in particular, but women too, have an incredibly strong tie to community in a way, on average, of course it's not true for everybody, but on average, in a way that majority group members don't have. So I think it's both. It's not an either or, it's a both situation. Question?
Let me just ask, is what you're talking about, is that part of Donald Trump's platform?
I don't know, I hope not.
So in this study, these were the results with this summary study, right? Like that you would change the abstract, the summary,
No, these are the data from our research assistants. The data for what you're talking, the abstracts, right?
Oh, yeah.
So this is later, and this was an experiment. Oops, I'm going the wrong way, sorry.
Did it change, so you didn't show, so your results were focused on URM students here. Did it change at all for white students?
Yes. So the reason, in this particular series of studies, we found that everybody benefited. Everybody benefited from when we had an abstract. Now remember, these are freshmen and sophomore undergraduates, and they aren't fully invested yet in their science curriculum. They're still figuring things out.
But did they benefit more or less? I mean,
In this particular, at this level, everybody equally benefited. Now we expected to see URM differences, and we expected to see maybe gender differences as well. We didn't have the sample to look at women who are URM in this particular study. Partly, we think in retrospect, in this particular set of studies, we had a lot of underrepresented minority students. They were primarily from Cal State Long Beach, and they were Latino. So we didn't have actually as many majority group students in this particular series of studies. But we find over and over again, men, majority group members, also, like when things get really hard and you're washing dishes, if you can take a step back and say, it's part of something bigger, muscle through this, right? Your self-regulation, your ebbing and flowing of your motivation, it gives you something to hang on to when things get really boring and when things get harder and difficult. It also provides fodder for how to talk about it. So Dustin has done research showing that when people leave this experience and they go out into the world and they start talking to their friends, or they talk to their parents, or they talk to if you can talk to people about this thing that you're doing, if you show, hey, yeah, I'm here washing dishes, like, but I'm I didn't get his name, as the colleague was saying, right? Like, as you talk to alumni, or if you can talk to that, actually improves your interest. Right? So it gives people a shared understanding. Now, yes, at the end of the day, you're answering a very basic research question. Your science doesn't have to change. But the way that we talk about and communicate to students, especially at the lower levels, is incredibly important. But what's fascinating about our stuff is we have research assistants. They've gotten through a lot of the process already. And adding in a communal piece, seeing the communal value above and beyond, they're already clearly highly passionate for, or they wouldn't be research assistants as juniors, right? They would have dropped out already. It still predicts their motivation in time to continue. So we also have data looking at how much they apply to graduate school, how much they're intending to apply to graduate school, how many programs. An interesting side effect of that is what we also discovered is that many first-generation students who are more likely to be our URM students don't want to leave where they are. There's residential immobility. They don't want to go to Johns Hopkins. They don't want, it's not because they have a fear of a big city, especially in some place like Long Beach. I mean, they're in Los Angeles. They're not in a small town. Now, you could make that argument in Montana, but it stands up with both samples. Students feel that sense of commitment and have obligations that sometimes we forget. You can't just say, go to Johns Hopkins and buy your plane ticket and come home whenever you want. That assumes a level of financial stability as well as just time. I mean, how many of you could just fly home all the time as a graduate student, right? So even the way in which the communal piece plays a part in going to graduate school, it comes up there too. So they could be incredibly smart, very passionate, really good at science, and then still not go into graduate school because of this requirement that you go all over the nation in terms of wherever you get in. So that's kind of a downer. Somebody asked me a more uplifting question. Hurry up.
So keep asking questions, but we're officially say thank you.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely.